All right, buckle up because today we're going deep, really deep into some intense territory with chapter 3 of the Book of the Law.
Oh, yeah, this one's a doozy.
It is. It is. And before we even start unpacking all of this, you should know that this chapter,
It's a lot.
yeah, this chapter, read aloud by Lon Milo DuQuette, is it's packed with imagery and ideas that might make you feel maybe a little uncomfortable.
It's definitely not your typical feel-good spiritual text.
No, no, it's not.
Oh,
But that's part of what makes it so fascinating, right?
exactly. What's really striking is how this chapter just sets a tone that's so different from what you usually find in spiritual texts, and it all starts with that very first word.
You're talking about abrahadabra,
Yeah,
right?
that's the one. It seems like something you'd hear a stage magician say, but in the Book of the Law, it's linked to, well, an Egyptian god named Ra-Hoor-Kit. Not exactly your typical warm and fuzzy deity.
No, definitely not.
Mm.
Kit is all about war and vengeance, and that really sets the stage for this chapter's focus on power, conquest, and challenging those traditional beliefs.
Yeah, it flips the script on what you might expect from a spiritual text.
It really does.
Okay.
Okay, so let's dive into this idea of war and conquest, because the chapter gets pretty specific. It talks about things like choosing an island, then fortifying it, and then even using a war engine to take down your enemies. It almost reads like a military strategy guide, which seems a bit jarring in a spiritual text.
Right. You don't usually see those two worlds collide. It's important to remember that the Book of the Law was written in the early 20th century, a time when global tensions, well, they were running pretty high. New ideologies were emerging, and the world was kind of on the brink of this massive conflict. So it makes you wonder if these themes of war in the chapter, maybe they reflect some of the anxieties of that era.
That's interesting. It's like the chapter is channeling this undercurrent of unrest and maybe even saying that power and conflict are there are these inherent parts of the human experience, even in the spiritual realm.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just physical conquest, you know what I mean? The chapter also delves into this whole world of ritual and symbolism, which suggests there's a psychological dimension to this whole idea of warfare.
Right. There are these really detailed instructions for creating a secret temple, acquiring something called a stela of revealing, and even using specific materials like blood and cakes for rituals. It's like, I don't know, it feels like a recipe for some kind of ancient magic.
Yeah, it's got that mysterious, almost alchemical vibe.
It does. So let's start with something that always grabs my attention. Blood sacrifice. I mean, it's been a part of various ancient cultures throughout history. What do you make of it?
Well, it's definitely not for the squeamish, but in some contexts, it represented a way to offer something precious to the divine, or maybe to establish a more direct connection with the spiritual realm.
So it's not necessarily about violence for violence's sake. It's more about the power of sacrifice and this idea that sometimes you have to give something up to gain something greater.
Exactly. And the use of specific ingredients and magical practices, well, that also has a long and complex history. Think about the ingredients in a recipe. Each one contributes to the final outcome. And in the same way, each ingredient in a ritual, well, it's believed to carry its own, symbolic meaning and power.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about this secret temple? Is it supposed to be an actual physical place, or is it more of a metaphor?
It could be both. On a literal level, it might refer to a hidden space where these rituals are performed.
Right.
But on a deeper level, I think it could represent the creation of a sacred inner space,
Right.
a mental sanctuary dedicated to this new spiritual path.
It's like building your own internal fortress of belief, a place where you can connect with this god of war on your own terms, away from all those traditional religious structures.
Yes, and that sense of individuality is really key here. The chapter seems to be encouraging a very personal, almost DIY approach to spirituality, one that challenges the authority of established religious institutions.
And speaking of challenging authority, we can't ignore the role of the Scarlet Woman in this chapter. She's described in a way that's both alluring and dangerous, which definitely piques my curiosity. What do you make of her?
Well, the Scarlet Woman is a powerful and complex figure. On the one hand, she represents immense power and influence. The chapter even suggests that if she stays loyal, she'll reach the pinnacles of power. But there's also a dark side to all of this. If she strays from the path, well, the consequences are brutal.
Whoa, so it's like she's being offered this incredible power, but with some very serious strings attached. It makes you wonder about the nature of freedom and control in this spiritual system.
Exactly. The Scarlet Woman embodies this tension between freedom and control. She's a symbol of this, well, this liberated female energy, but she's also operating within a very strict framework. It makes you question, is she truly free? Or is she a pawn in a larger game?
It's definitely a lot more nuanced than it might seem at first glance. On the one hand, she seems to challenge traditional ideas about women and their roles in society. But on the other hand, she's still defined by her relationship to this male god of war. It's fascinatingly complicated.
Absolutely. And it reflects the often paradoxical nature of power dynamics.
Okay, so we've got war, we've got ritual, we've got this enigmatic Scarlet Woman. But let's talk about the elephant of the room, the blasphemy.
Yeah, we can't ignore that.
We can't. The chapter just goes all in, taking aim at major religions and figures like Jesus, Muhammad, and Mary. Doesn't pull any punches.
And the language is deliberately provocative. It's clearly designed to shock and offend, to shake people out of their complacency. But the question is, what's the motivation behind it all? Is it just shock value, or is it something deeper?
Well, if we think back to that historical context, remember, this was a time when people were starting to question all kinds of authority, religious institutions, governments, social norms, the whole 9 yards.
You're right. So maybe this blasphemy is about rejecting the authority of established religion. It's like declaring independence from traditional beliefs. It's like saying, we're not playing by your rules anymore.
Yeah. It's like the chapter is urging its readers to forge their own paths, even if it means going against everything they've been taught.
Exactly. And in that sense, the blasphemy becomes a tool for empowerment.
Interesting.
A way to break free from dogma and connect with the divine, but on your own terms.
Which brings us to another key figure in the chapter, the prophet. He's given very specific instructions, things like setting up a clerk house, overseeing ordeals, and spreading the word about the book. What's interesting is that his role seems to blend this spiritual leadership with practical, almost bureaucratic tasks.
It's true. The role of the prophet here isn't just about receiving those divine revelations. It's about building a movement, spreading the word, and establishing this new system of belief.
It's like the prophet is this bridge between the spiritual and the material world. He takes these big cosmic ideas and tries to ground them in reality.
Yeah, you see that duality in the instructions he's given. He's told to oversee ordeals, which sounds a lot like spiritual testing and purification.
Right.
But he's also responsible for setting up this clerk house, which points to a more organizational, practical role.
It's as if the chapter recognizes that if this new spiritual path is going to take root and spread, it needs both vision and organization.
Exactly. And that tension between the mystical and the mundane, the visionary and the practical, it's something that a lot of spiritual movements have to grapple with. How do you translate these profound, often ineffable experiences into something that other people can understand and embrace?
It's a great question, and I think it's one that we'll need to keep in mind as we continue to explore the mysteries of this chapter. Now, you mentioned that the chapter gives instructions for making cakes using different kinds of blood, and that this might be related to other occult practices.
It is. And what's really interesting is that the chapter doesn't just say, use blood. It gets very specific, mentioning blood of the moon, blood of a child, and even blood of enemies.
Wow. Okay, that's definitely intense imagery. And it makes you wonder about the significance of each type of blood.
Right. For example, in some occult traditions, the blood of the moon might symbolize feminine energy or the cyclical nature of life, since the moon, it goes through those phases.
So it's not about literal blood, but rather what that substance represents.
Exactly. It's about tapping into those energies rather than about a physical act.
Okay. What about blood of a child? That one seems especially disturbing.
It does, but remember, we're looking at this through a symbolic lens. In some mystical traditions, blood of a child might represent innocence, purity, or untapped potential. It's about the essence of new beginnings.
Okay.
Again, this is not condoning any harmful practices. We're trying to understand the symbolism within a specific system of belief.
That makes sense. And I guess blood of enemies is pretty straightforward. It's about harnessing the power of those you've defeated.
Exactly. And remember, the chapter also mentions using these cakes to curse enemies, which further blurs the lines between spiritual practice and, something a lot darker.
Okay, so it's not just about meditating and finding inner peace. This chapter is also about power dynamics, conflict, and maybe even a touch of vengeance. It's definitely a far cry from what most people think of as spirituality.
It is, and that complexity is what makes it so fascinating. We could spend hours unpacking the symbolism of these rituals and still only scratch the surface.
I bet. So this theme of conquest that we see with the war imagery and the blood rituals, it kind of permeates every aspect of the chapter, right?
It really does. From building that secret temple to the role of the Scarlet Woman, it's all about power, control, and challenging traditional ideas.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already. We've explored the themes of war, ritual, and blasphemy, and we've discussed the roles of the Scarlet Woman and the prophet. We've even delved into the symbolism of blood and the concept of a secret temple. But there's still so much more to unpack.
Oh, there is. And honestly, this chapter isn't for the faint of heart. It's challenging, provocative, and it forces you to confront some uncomfortable ideas.
It does. It's definitely not your typical bedtime reading,
No.
but it is incredibly thought-provoking. It makes you question everything you think you know about belief, spirituality, and the role of the individual in shaping their own destiny.
Absolutely. And it doesn't shy away from the darker aspects of human nature. In fact, it seems to embrace them.
Yeah, like it's saying that those darker impulses, ambition, the desire for power, the thirst for revenge, they're all part of what makes us human. Maybe the key isn't to deny them, but to find a way to harness and transform them.
Perhaps. It's a dangerous game, but the potential rewards are immense.
And the risks.
Well, let's just say that the chapter makes it clear that failure isn't an option. But we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Right, there's still so much more to explore in this chapter.
There is.
In fact, you mentioned that it gets even more intense with the vision of civilizations rising and falling, new prophets emerging, and even a god named Humakis returning. It all sounds pretty epic.
It is, and it raises some big questions like whether this chapter is meant to be taken literally or symbolically. What do you think? Is this a blueprint for action or a metaphor for internal transformation?
Honestly, I'm not sure yet, but that's part of what makes this deep dive so intriguing. It's like a puzzle box full of cryptic clues, and it's up to each of us to piece together our own understanding of what it all means.
I agree, and I think that's one of the reasons why the Book of the Law continues to fascinate people. It doesn't offer easy answers.
Oh, it doesn't?
But it challenges us to think critically, to question our assumptions, and to confront the complexity of the human experience.
And maybe even to tap into that raw, primal energy that lurks beneath the surface of our civilized selves. But as you said before, we need to tread carefully.
Absolutely. These waters run deep.
Duly noted.
Yeah.
But I think it's time for us to take a quick pause and then dive even deeper into this chapter.
So, picking up where we left off, you mentioned that things get even more intense in Chapter 3 with a vision of civilizations rising and falling and this idea of a returning god named Humakis.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. It almost reads like a cosmic prophecy, like a glimpse into the cyclical nature of power, empires, and belief systems. But honestly, it's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is. But before we go there, I think it's worth circling back to this idea of a clerk house and these ordeals that the prophet's instructed to oversee.
Right.
These details might seem a bit, maybe mundane compared to blood rituals and cosmic prophecies. But I think they're really crucial to understanding how this new spiritual system was actually, meant to function.
You're right. It's easy to get caught up in the more dramatic aspects of the chapter, but these practical elements ground it in a way. So what exactly is a clerk house in this context? It sounds pretty, bureaucratic.
Well, if you think about it, any organized system of belief needs some kind of administrative structure, right?
I guess so.
The clerk house seems to be exactly that. A place for record keeping, disseminating information, and maybe even managing resources.
So it's like the administrative headquarters of this new spiritual movement.
Yeah, it's something like that.
Makes sense. And what about these ordeals? They sound a bit more, intense.
They do. The word ordeal often evokes those images of, trials and tests. And that seems to be the case here as well. In many spiritual traditions, undergoing an ordeal is a way to prove your commitment. Maybe to purify yourself or to demonstrate your worthiness, to receive higher knowledge.
So it's not just about blindly accepting the teachings. Right. There's a process of testing and proving yourself along the way.
Right.
It adds a layer of seriousness and commitment to this whole path.
Exactly. And it also reinforces this idea of personal responsibility that we see throughout the chapter. You're not just passively following a set of rules. You're actively shaping your own spiritual journey through these ordeals.
Okay, so we've got this administrative side with the clerk house,
Yeah.
and then these personal challenges of the ordeals, but then there's this whole other layer with the cosmic prophecy.
Right.
It talks about the fall of civilizations, the rise of new prophets, and even the return of this god Humachis. It also feels like a separate story within the chapter.
It does, and it's hard not to draw parallels to other apocalyptic or messianic traditions that talk about these cycles of destruction and renewal.
Right, like that idea of the phoenix rising from the ashes.
Exactly. It makes you wonder if this prophecy is meant to be taken literally, like a prediction of future events, or if it's more, symbolic.
It's a great question.
And honestly, there's no easy answer. Some people might interpret it as a literal roadmap of the future, while others might see it as a metaphor for the cyclical nature of spiritual evolution, both on a personal and a collective level.
It's like the chapter is saying that change is inevitable, that empires will rise and fall, and beliefs will be challenged and transformed.
Hmm.
But ultimately, there's this larger cosmic order at play.
Exactly. And within that cosmic order, individuals have the power to choose their own path, to align themselves with the forces of creation or destruction, to embrace their own potential for power and transformation.
Okay, so we've talked about war, ritual, blasphemy, and even cosmic prophecies. But there's one element in this chapter that I find particularly unsettling: the instructions for creating those cakes using different types of blood.
Yeah, that one tends to stick with you.
It does. We touched on this earlier, but I think it deserves a deeper dive.
I agree. It's one of the most striking and honestly disturbing aspects of the chapter.
What's really fascinating and a little unnerving is the specificity of the instructions. It's not just about using any blood. It mentions blood of the moon, blood of a child, and blood of enemies. It's very deliberate.
It is, and I think it's important to approach this with a sense of historical and cultural awareness. We've already talked about how blood has been used symbolically in many traditions, often representing life force, vitality, or a connection to the divine.
Right, but even knowing that, it's still hard to shake that initial feeling of discomfort.
I understand. And remember, we're not trying to condone or justify any harmful practices.
Of course not.
We're simply trying to understand the symbolism within the context of this specific text.
So let's break it down. You mentioned earlier that blood of the moon might symbolize feminine energy or the cyclical nature of life. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Of course. In many cultures, the moon is associated with feminine energy, intuition, and the ebb and flow of life cycles. Think about the phases of the moon waxing, waning, full, new. It's a constant cycle of change and renewal.
So using blood of the moon in these cakes could be a way of tapping into those energies, of aligning yourself with those natural rhythms.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that in some occult traditions, the moon is also associated with magical power and the ability to manifest desires, so there might be an element of that as well.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about blood of a child? That one's a bit harder to reconcile with those more positive interpretations.
It is. And again, I want to be very clear that we're not talking about literal blood or condoning any harm to children. In this context, blood of a child is most likely a symbolic representation of innocence, purity, or untapped potential.
So it's not about the physical substance, but rather about what it represents. The essence of new beginnings, of limitless possibility.
Precisely. And remember, the chapter also talks about using these cakes to curse enemies.
Right.
So it's possible that the blood of a child is being used in a way that's meant to disrupt or even destroy those negative forces.
It's almost like a magical countermeasure, a way of using innocence and purity as a weapon against darkness.
Interesting take.
It's a strange and unsettling concept, but it kind of fits with the chapter's overall themes of power, conflict, and transformation.
It does, and it speaks to the complexity of this text and the challenges it presents to our modern sensibilities. But if we can set aside our initial reactions and approach it with an open mind, I think there's a lot we can learn from it.
I agree. And it's important to remember that we're only scratching the surface here. There are layers upon layers of meaning to unpack in this chapter.
Absolutely. And as we delve deeper, I think we'll start to see how all of these seemingly disparate elements, the war imagery, the rituals, the blasphemy, the prophecies, are actually interconnected, woven together to create a tapestry of profound spiritual insight.
All right, so we've really gone deep into the symbolism and the themes of Chapter 3 of the Book of the Law, from war and conquest to ritual magic and cosmic prophecies. this chapter is, well, it's definitely a wild ride. But there's one more element that we need to talk about. Something that's both, well, it's both intriguing and a little bit unsettling.
You're talking about the secret fourfold word that the chapter mentions, right? The one it calls, well, the blasphemy against all gods of men.
Yes. It's like this cryptic message tucked away within a chapter that's already, well, it's full of cryptic messages.
Right.
What do you think it means?
Well, it's clear that this fourfold word is meant to be something incredibly powerful, something that challenges the very foundations of, well, of traditional belief systems. And the fact that it's presented as a blasphemy,
Right.
well, it suggests that it's meant to disrupt and overturn those systems.
It's almost like a verbal weapon,
Yeah.
a way to dismantle the power structures of established religions and assert the individual's right to kind of forge their own path.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that the chapter doesn't actually reveal what this fourfold word is.
It doesn't.
It's like a secret that's being withheld.
A secret.
And mystery that's left for the reader to, well, to unravel.
It's like a challenge, a dare to the reader to push the boundaries of their own understanding and explore these uncharted territories of spiritual experience.
I think you're right. And that challenge, that invitation to delve deeper, it's at the heart of this entire chapter. It's about questioning everything, rejecting dogma, and embracing the power of the individual to, well, to create their own reality.
So if we pull back and look at everything we've explored in this deep dive, what do you think is the ultimate message of chapter 3 of the Book of the Law?
It's a tough question, but I think it's a call to, well, to radical self-empowerment.
Okay.
A rejection of external authority in favor of a more personal and direct connection with, well, with the divine.
It's about embracing your own power, even the darker aspects of it, and using it to, well, to create the life you want.
And to forge your own spiritual path, even if it means challenging the beliefs and values of, of the society around you.
It's a bold message, and one that I think still resonates with people today. We're bombarded with information and opinions, and it's easy to feel lost and disempowered. But this chapter reminds us that we have the power to choose what we believe, to create our own meaning, and to shape our own destiny.
It's a message of liberation, of breaking free from the constraints of dogma and embracing the full potential of the human spirit.
Well said.
Yeah.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Okay.
But before we go, I want to leave you with a final question to ponder.
Right.
Is chapter 3 of the Book of the Law meant to be taken literally? Or is it primarily symbolic?
Right.
What do you think is the ultimate message of this chapter, considering its blend of war, ritual, blasphemy, and prophecy?
It's a question that doesn't have easy answers, but it's one worth wrestling with. And as always, we encourage you to continue exploring the book and its interpretations on your own.
Absolutely. There's a whole world of knowledge and insight waiting to be discovered. So until next time, keep diving deep.